I think we oftentimes go through life not really knowing what we want, and that lack of clarity can be a dangerous thing. Choices once made can never be unmade. Cause and effect flow in only one direction. It would be rather confusing if it worked any other way, as one young bride discovers in tonight's story. Would you, could you, on a train? The young bride dabbed at her forehead with a gloved hand. She didn't like standing on train platforms. There was too much waiting, movement, noise, people, loud, oblivious men, lords and workmen and ill-behaved boys, and in tow behind them so many women, young ones in corsets with yards of hair piled atop pretty heads, and older ones too, with full bosoms and long-suffering eyes. The bride grabbed her husband's hand. He was so lovely in profile, and always so well turned out. He wore a long coat and top hat, and she a day dress with a white hat tied under her chin. They were a good match. She often thought to herself how beautiful he was and how lucky she was to have him. Mother had commented on his good looks at once. Their generous difference in age, once such a concern, was immediately forgotten. "What a beauty he is," Mother said, in a shameless stage whisper, so the maids would hear. "The profile of a god, and that ring, a diamond to make the queen jealous. You marry him, girl, marry him." And so she did. Now they stood together on the platform, awaiting the train that would take them to a ship, and then on to their honeymoon in warmer climes. She squeezed his hand, but for all the young bride's hope and sweat, her groom did not smile and did not look back at her. His eyes, as they often were, seemed lost in his own unknowable musing. A whistle called, and they moved forward. Women looked at him as they passed, some discreetly, some less so. Their jealousy gave the bride a delicious taste of power, a rare treat in her world. She held her small chin high. Mother would remind her that pride was sinful. She might even snap her daughter's hand and call her a silly cowbird, but that was nonsense and jealousy too. The young bride was a winner. She hadn't settled for a failed businessman, then banker, then salesman, then plain old nothing, like Mother had. A wealthy man was armor, and a charming one a sword. The old creature at the flower stand had learned that lesson. She might speak disrespectfully to some silly girl half her age, but when the man appeared and inquired what was troubling his wife, the world took a different order. The bride enjoyed watching the hag bow her head. "Yes," she thought, "remember your role, you sow, and notice how I enjoy your humiliation, for you were never me, and I shall never be you." Yet even the best ointment has its flies. Sometimes she wondered if she was pretty enough for him. She would have been humiliated for others to know how often she dwelled on this. Maybe it was the fate of every woman who lived in a world that judged on appearances. There were many faces, both lovely and plain, on the platform. There were rich women who looked like hounds, but also urchins with features like angels. She noticed them all, so surely her husband did too. The men, unlike their wives, made no attempt to hide their gazing as the couple strode past. Prince or pauper, the bride paid them no mind. Why should she bother when she had this prize on her arm? But was her husband as satisfied as she was? She'd asked him before, sometimes playfully, sometimes with a desperation she hoped concealed. He would pat her hand and tell her not to be a silly child, but this didn't properly answer her question. He'd known other women before, and had never hidden it. Was it just her imagination that his eyes darted about the crowd, admiring what there was to see? Hadn't he often lingered a long moment when addressing a shop girl? There had been a moment early in the courtship. Mother was at her vanity. She laughed her hearty way and said to her daughter, "Men will look, my girl. It is simply what they do. They look, and sometimes they do more." Very typical mother, that was. A poke when there should have been a kiss. Still, the young bride asked herself, could she blame him for looking, if that was man's nature? And was it not true, after all, that he'd picked her over everyone when he could have had anyone? What explanation was there for this, except that she truly was the prettiest and that he loved her? She was his bride, the only he'd ever had, and there would be no others. She held his arm a bit more tightly. This man, her beautiful man. He was tall, even in loafers, while she was nearly his equal in her heeled boots. The high hat made a tower of him. She imagined herself riding on his shoulder, looking down upon the countryside from the battlements. They were giants, or at least he was, and she could borrow from his power. Finally, they boarded the train. The whistle blew again. There was a throng of people settling in, but he handled the tickets, their belongings, everything. All she had to do was ignore the crowd, the overlapping voices, the endless swirling skirts, the hats whose feathers might poke her face. Porters with luggage pushed everywhere. Soon they found themselves seated in a luxurious compartment with benches on either end and a window. There were 2 couples seated with them, but she paid little attention. She was busy removing her hat, which would sit alongside her husband's, between them. "It's a lovely train," she said to him. "Dear?" He turned briefly to her and said, "What?" "Yes, it was terrible." He was digging in his pocket, perhaps for his watch. She took a breath and looked around. It was then she noticed the woman seated diagonally from her. Unlike the others in the compartment, she was alone. She looked like a proper lady, in an embroidered white dress, with fine lace ruffles that reached to her sharp jawline, and halfway down the backs of her white, delicate hands. She had the grandest hat of all, broad and white, with cream flowers and feathers, held in place by a cream silk ribbon. And the young bride's suspicion was confirmed when a porter stepped into the cabin and, speaking quietly about some private matter, addressed her as "Your Ladyship." The groom had found and checked his watch and returned it to his pocket. The young bride looked at him again and saw that his eyes were now on the lady in white. He seemed to be studying her, and when the lady looked the couple's way, he gave her a charming smile. The young bride gripped his hand again and said, "This must have all been so very expensive, and all for me." What? The tickets, were they expensive?" Finally, he looked at her. What? Did they now? I'm sorry, no, I don't think I did." And even as the young bride looked at her husband, he smiled again at the lady, who just looked out the window. This was it, the game that she wasn't sure he knew they were playing. It reminded her of so many dinners with mother and father. She'd sat silently as mother spoke of anything and everything. There was little opportunity to interject, so daughter said nothing. The servant said nothing. But most of all, father said nothing. He sat there, cutting his steak or stabbing a potato, while mother looked at him with growing agitation and filled the silence with herself. It was so often like this, all their lives together, in their showplace of a home that only the convenient passing of mother's parents had provided for them. So now the young bride sat at her groom's side for a few more minutes, near but not with him. The other passengers chatted, but he, she, and the proper lady all said nothing. Silence was something the bride had never come to like. People spoke of comfortable silences, but she found this an elusive concept. Silences to her were dangerous. Anything could happen while things were quiet. It was usually better to speak or cough or shuffle or do anything to break it. Give those around you something to respond to, like mother did. Noise was safety because it distracted the body and quieted the mind. She thought now, as she too often did, of the night she'd walked into her parents' room to find father strangling mother on their bed. The young bride remembered the gurgling sounds and mother's flailing arms. A drop of saliva dripped from the corner of father's mouth onto mother's face. His face, neck, and hands were blood red, while mother's entire body, under her torn nightdress, was stark white. They were both frozen in place when their daughter entered the room, and they looked at her stupidly. Perhaps it was the worst silence of her parents' lives. But for the shocked daughter, it was merely the strangest. Mother's face was in mid-scream, father's trembling hands still tight around her neck. The daughter started to say, I thought I heard something. Father pushed past her, naked from the waist down, and she looked away, revolted. Mother turned away onto her side, and the daughter simply returned to her room and put out the lamp. There were no tears and little concern, just shock. They never spoke of it. This was the moment when the daughter realized, truly and completely, how mad her parents were, and how little she loved them. But now, aboard this train, she was the one who felt mad. She felt choked by the silence as she babbled to her husband like a baby, while he ignored her. She dabbed at her forehead again, then, smiling, turned to him. I'm going to powder my nose, she said. It was just back there, wasn't it? And she gestured vaguely outside the compartment. Only now did he focus. Powder? Oh, yes, dear, yes, go through there. First is the ladies, and then the gents. We passed it on the way. He gave her a chaste kiss on the cheek. He didn't stand or offer to guide her. She stepped out alone, teeth clenched behind a safely blank expression. She didn't look back, but knew his eyes would soon return to the unaccompanied lady. Ignore him, she said to the lady in her mind. That rogue, that dog. The blow to his ego might do us both some good. Passengers and crew were still milling about, showing tickets, taking their seats, scolding their children. The young bride passed one compartment after another, and again she took stock of the women. There were two older women traveling together and chatting merrily, perhaps sisters. She'd always wished for a sister. She'd never done anything jolly with Mother. Mother hated being around anyone she didn't already know. The young bride also saw women of all ages accompanied by men who seemed pleased to be with them. But just as many of the men looked as bored as her own husband. She noticed how their eyes fell eagerly upon her as she passed by. Their bold stares were like icy little stabs. But she also felt, somewhere distantly, the silent, ancient rage of their wives, and she resented her fellow women for this. She'd done nothing to incur this attention, but she also knew precisely how they felt. Her smugness of only moments ago seemed miles away now. It took quite a bit longer than she'd thought to find the ladies' room, but she hadn't been paying much attention to their path as they boarded. Trains go in a straight line, don't they? How hard can it be to find one's way? The powder room was opulent, with Tiffany glass and fine carved wood, but it was also quite small, only large enough for one. She let out a relieved breath and locked the door behind her. At least in here, she had peace. The young bride stood in front of the mirror, admiring her trim form in the glass and the delicate curves of her heart-shaped face. Yet it was also a sad face, she realized, one that in the fullness of time would age and lose what meager ability it enjoyed today to hold her groom's attention. Oh, but the hold he had on her! Boys had flattered her as she matured, and strange men had complimented her in their awkward, unwelcome way. But only her groom had truly pursued her. He was respectful and chaste as manners demanded, but it wasn't long before he swept her up in his arms and buried her in kisses. She felt no guilt at having given in to lust before they were married. As eager as he'd been, she'd been twice so. She knew that a lady wasn't to speak of such things or even acknowledge them, but she'd been ready and so hungry for his proximity. She fell in love with his beauty and his confidence, and she had believed this was enough. A man of his age had been beautiful for years and would be so for many years more. And when his allure eventually faded, she would be much younger than him and still lovely, and would surely have grown to love the mysteries within him that she had not yet begun to guess. And at least then, in his twilight, he would be hers alone, for only she would remember what he had been, and only she would still see that when she looked at his sagging face. She sometimes thought about this as he slept beside her. When they made love, there was nothing in the world but the two of them, and his eyes were intent upon hers. Everything there was to share was shared only with each other. Yet, when they emerged back into the world, it sometimes felt as if all at once he forgot her, even as she clung to him like a child. She would endure this, she knew, to have a husband, security, and escape from mother and father. And most of all, to have him, this being that amazed and fascinated and satisfied her in every way except... But no, she thought quickly, don't think about that. Not ever. And she pushed the thought away. She'd always thought herself pretty, though mother had once slapped her for saying so aloud. She must be, because he'd chosen her, and this always was the conclusion with which she consoled herself. No matter his limitations, no matter the ways in which he disappointed her already, and no matter what personal feelings were her private burden, still, despite it all, he chose her. What more did she want from him? To never look upon another woman again? To never notice that another woman could be lovely? That was absurd. And yet she had to admit, now in this private place, yes, that is precisely what she wanted, because her husband, for whatever reason, was unable to notice in moderation. He could only notice to the exclusion of all other things, including his devoted but worried bride. And now the tears came, not in a flood, only a trickle, but it was the first time she'd allowed herself a moment to really think on this, to reckon with the fact that, for all his charm and wealth, he was limited in a way that she wasn't, and it was a limit she would never understand. From that first night, there could be no man but him, because none for her could ever compare. So why did he not reciprocate? Was he incapable, or could he simply not be bothered? She looked at herself in the glass, disgusted by her weakness. She imagined what mother would say, that you could only expect so much from the male of the species. They were strong, she'd say, but stupid. Yet this was just another lie, the rationalization of an aging woman whose life consisted primarily of disappointment. The young bride knew her husband wasn't stupid. He knew what he was doing, and the fact that it hurt her was seemingly of little consequence. And that was when she had the thought, for the very first time in their relationship, there is a part of me that resents him. There is a part of me that wishes there was another way. I wish I was free in the way he is free. I wish all the ugly parts of this could simply go. And then, in response, another voice spoke. It asked, "Are you sure? Is that what you want?" And before she could think better of it, she saw her tears in the mirror, and that thought, the one she must never think, came back to her. And at once she said to herself, "I do. Oh yes, yes, I do." Suddenly the door of the cubicle behind her swung open, and the bride found herself transfixed, as the woman who emerged appeared to be another version of herself. She was, in fact, an exact copy of herself, from her hair to her shoes to the tears brimming in her eyes. And the version of her standing at the sink thought, "My goodness, have I always been that beautiful? I could be a real Gibson girl," as another part of her cried out that something here was very amiss. It seemed to the bride that she was seeing this scene from two angles, and that she was equally perplexed in both of them. Then, as if on wheels, the version of her within the cubicle came forward, and seemed almost to step into the shoes of the woman at the sink. And just like that, there was one bride again, not two, and it was like the peculiar moment had never happened. The bride ran her hands under cool water. She had a feeling she must ground herself, that something very odd had just happened, but the memory of it was already leaving her. Now she must prepare herself for the judgment of her fellow passengers. She tended to her face, wiped her tears, and steadied herself. Then she made her way back toward their car, near the front of the train. The way back was quieter now. People had settled in. The train was ready to depart. The bride stepped into their compartment, and it seemed the same as before. The occupants, however, had changed. Her husband was gone, though the proper lady in white was still there. But the couple sat across from her. They were now 4 older women, older than Mother. Hadn't they been 2 married couples before, or was she misremembering? "Excuse me," the young bride said. "I believe I was seated here. "Oh, yes, dear," said one of the older women. "This is your seat, see? Your hat is there where you left it." The bride looked down, and, indeed, there was her lovely hat and ribbon next to where her husband's hat had been. "Did he excuse himself?" she asked, wondering why he would take his hat and coat if he only needed to step away. "He was here a moment ago." The 4 women looked at each other, and a different one said, "Oh, no, dear. Was there a man? You sat here alone, didn't you?" "Yes, that's right," said another. "I was just behind you as we boarded. I didn't see a man with you. Did he perhaps arrive separately?" The young bride felt strange. The flush was coming back to her face. "That's not right," she said. "You must have seen him." Blank stares greeted her. She felt a drop of sweat plummet down her back. "He's quite tall," she said, talking faster now. "Auburn hair, very handsome, you must have noticed." Again she looked from face to face, and in the eyes of these elders she now saw less confusion and more concern. She laughed, and the laugh sounded crazy to her own ears. A blush bloomed across her face. "Dear, why don't you have a seat?" asked the first woman. "We'll have the porter fetch you some water. Are you hungry? Have you come a long way?" Through all this, the proper lady seemed to take no notice. The young bride grabbed her hat and ran further up the train. Men excused themselves while women gave her irritated looks. She felt clammy all over, and she shivered. She dabbed at the back of her neck with her glove, then at her forehead. She knew her eyes were wild, but she had never felt a fear like this. Why was she so afraid? Surely she'd just entered the wrong compartment, or her husband had needed to speak with someone from the crew. Maybe he'd seen someone he knew and went to chat. And here again came the thought, the one she was forbidden to think. It had happened 2 nights before, just 2 nights after their wedding, and like that horror from so many years ago, she'd heard a strange sound from her parents' room. She ignored it at first. She really didn't care if her parents murdered each other this time. In a way, it would make things easier. There would be the inheritance, the house. She could dismiss the servants she didn't like. There would finally be something of her own, something that wasn't just borrowed, and in that added security she could have private peace. Or perhaps they could sell for a tidy sum and make something all new together. But then the noise shook the wall again, and she thought, no, I mustn't ignore this. My groom is here, sleeping beside me, and I've hinted at what mother and father are like, but if he kills her tonight, that's really too much. I have to silence them, and failing that, I'll have to explain their madness to my husband fully, lest he think I'm mad right along with them. So she rose from her childhood bed and covered herself in a robe. It was at this point that she turned and saw that her groom wasn't beside her in bed after all. The sheets were disturbed, but empty. Mother made a sound from down the hall. The young bride asked herself, had she ever heard Mother make a sound like that? Maybe when she was a very young girl, and there was still a dim hope for love or a memory of passion between Mother and Father. But this was different. This was no memory. This was a woman awakened from a long sleep by something new. She crept out into the hallway, proceeding with dread toward her parents' room. She was only halfway there when the washroom door opened, and out came Father. He didn't see her, nor did he return to the bedroom, but instead shuffled off toward the kitchen. Meanwhile, from their bedroom, Mother continued to make cries of pleasure. The daughter's entire body was hot like fire. She stood there motionless for a moment. Then, finally, she got back into her bed, and when she woke, her groom was asleep next to her again, showing no sign that he'd ever left. And they never spoke of where he went that night, or why Mother cried out, as the bride's entire life had trained her to do. The train whistle blew again. Somewhere behind her, a baby was crying. Somewhere further back, a dropped saucer shattered against the floor. Ahead of her was a blur of confused faces and identical compartments. Her groom was in none of them. Then, finally, there was only a wall of porters between her and the next car. They assured her that only the locomotive lay ahead, that her ticket was fine, and it was a single ticket, and they'd helped her board alone, and she must now find her seat. The porter led her back to a compartment. It was lavish and reserved for her alone. But that made an odd sort of sense, didn't it? Her groom was gone, truly gone, which meant his wealth was now only paying for one, and so could provide accommodations twice as grand as before. She was shivering. She could barely catch her breath. A little boy, just old enough to toddle along, came to the compartment door. Behind him were a school-age girl and a tired-looking mother. "Who's that pretty young lady?" the daughter asked, in the rudely loud whisper of children who mean no harm. The mother picked up her baby and then looked at the young bride. Her nose was turned up, but she gave the bride a little smile that might have been envy. Then she nodded and said quietly to just her daughter, "A rich young widow, I should think." The threesome quickly moved away, but the young bride heard the mother add, "The luckiest type of woman I know." This was when the bride noticed that her wedding ring was gone. She dabbed at her forehead again and had to stifle a laugh. The whistle blew for the final time, and the train began to leave the station. Outside on the platform was a well-dressed man in a long coat and top hat. His back was turned, so the young bride couldn't see his face, but he was the right height and build to be her husband, maybe. He was walking away. The young bride's eyes remained focused intently on him, even as the train surged forward. She wondered where the ride would take her. Would it still go to the seaside? Still to the ship that would have been their honeymoon? Perhaps she might go somewhere else now. She could go anywhere at all. She was thinking dimly of this and still watching the man when, finally, like a dark star in a bright sky, he twinkled his last among the crowd and vanished forever from her view. I suspect some listeners will decide that the young bride was not deserving of the freedom and comfort she finds in the end, especially after the haughtiness of her first impression. Fair enough, I'm not sure she's a likable person exactly. But it's true, I find, that still waters run deep. No maze was ever as complex as the human psyche. Once I realized how the mother and groom had conspired in their mutual betrayals of the young bride, I felt obligated as the author to rescue her, and the apparent cruelty of her disposition at the outset made a sad type of sense. If anyone out there should feel trapped by their life, I hope you find your own method of escape. It might not come as easily as wishing it out of your own reflection in a train washroom, but the life you should be leading is already out there without you. You simply need to find it and claim it. Until next time, don't forget me. N'est-ce pas?